Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is Great Big History Podcast. In this episode, we start part 3 of our course, East and West Africa. So, we start with 3000 BCE. We start with the first of our civilizations south of the Sahara, in what in the 19th century would have been called Black Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa. And what we find is that in East Africa, settled civilization, goes back as old as Egypt, which is one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. It develops along with Egypt, just south of the Second Cataract on the Nile. So this is Kush, the kingdom of Kush, and the kingdom of Kush is going to have a long-term trade and cultural ties with Egypt. They even have pyramids. Now, the pyramids are not as big as the Egyptian pyramids, but obviously they saw those pyramids. Kushites, Africans, went to Egypt, saw those pyramids, and brought back the knowledge of how to build, their own pyramids. So what we see is these long-term trade and cultural ties that go up the Nile. And the reason why is fairly obvious, right? All of these civilizations need other things. And so they need to trade. And who do they need to trade with? They need to trade with some kind of organization, kings. Because there's no such thing as companies and capitalism yet. They need someone they can make agreements with that they could go to and say, I need 100 tons of X. And I will give you 200 tons of Y. And so all of these groups that are on the Nile are going to develop along with each other at the same time period. So then what is East Africa's level of political development? Well, it's equivalent to Egypt's. It's equivalent to Mesopotamia's. It's on the same level. And so what we're dealing with is something that maybe you don't have to deal with. Maybe you're already beyond me. But when I grew up, what we learned about Africa was the colonialist, white man's burden, Kipling version of Africa. It was jungle. There was no civilization. There were no cities of any worth. There was no writing. It was a bunch of people living in the jungle waiting for National Geographic to come and take photos of them. They didn't even have clothes on. And you see this attitude, this colonialist attitude in National Geographic, which is started in the late 1800s and was perfectly fine, even in my day, even in the 1980s, to put on their photography the naked bodies of black and brown people. Whether it's from the Amazon or in the Congo, they had no problem showing the naked bodies of men and women of these indigenous cultures. White people, on the other hand, Europeans, never, ever, 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 ever. National Geographic did not go to Amsterdam and take naked photos of even, like, prostitutes. No. National Geographic in 1960 does not go to strip clubs in New York to do an investigative report of, that kind of society. No, that was pornography. That was obscene. But naked black and brown people, on the other hand, was perfectly fine. So we even had, at Camden County College, we even had a teacher who for 25 years, he's not here anymore, wouldn't teach any African history, saying that there was no Africa. There was no African history. Africa has no history. Well, what that's the level of ignorant racism that I had growing up. That was taught to me. And so if you find me highlighting levels of development, cities, culture, it's in a lot of ways against that attitude that was so pervasive even in my childhood. So what was the East Africa's level of political development? It was equivalent to Egypt's. It was equivalent to Mesopotamia's. It was kings who rose infantry armies. Now you go, well, why do we care? And it's because kings and infantry armies equals a sophisticated logistical and tax system. You need to be able to pay for those armies. You need to be able to make the weapons for those armies. You need to get them food. So you can't have just a bunch of dudes running around. It has to be a kingdom, an empire, a state. You have to have bureaucracies. You have to have organizations. Kush even conquered Egypt after the Bronze Age collapse and became the 25th dynasty. So if you're looking at our video, there is a sphinx with clearly a black man's face on it. We have hieroglyphics that depict black folk in tribute. This is giving a tribute in the hieroglyphics on the in the video. Obviously, it's offerings. So what we see is the integration of African, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and European cultures, all in Egypt. Whereas Egyptian culture is going up the Nile into Africa, African culture is coming down the Nile into Egypt. And from Egypt, it goes to Mesopotamia and to Europe. So there's this integration, this mixing of all of these different ideas, all these different cultures. And what that means is from the very, 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 very beginning of European culture, European civilization, part of it is black. Part of it is African, which will drive the racists nuts, but it's true. Because of all of this mixing. So we see this clearly in East Africa's connection to the Greek and Roman periods. So we in the Egyptian period, there's a lot of trade, there's a lot of negotiation, there's some mercenaries going back and forth. The Egyptian New Kingdom conquered Kush, and the Kingdom of Kush conquered Egypt after the Bronze Age collapse. Well, then there's the Assyrians, there's the Persians, and then there's Alexander, all of which had this kind of trade border, kind of raiding, kind of they fight, they don't fight on the first to second cataract of the Nile. And what about the Greek and Roman period? Well, after Alexander and then after the Romans conquer Egypt, we see kind of the continuation of this situation of what was going on with the Assyrians, what was going on with the Persians. It's trade, but also border raiding. In fact, there's a invasion by Meroe. Meroe is a successor state to Kush. After a couple hundred years, Kush falls apart. A new kingdom arises, new peoples, organizes the Nile in a new way, and that's Meroe. And they invade Egypt in 20 BCE. So that's not even just border raiding, that's a full-on invasion. The Romans respond, having stopped that invasion, by a counter-invasion up the Nile. And what they basically do is, it's too far. The Romans are too ensconced in Egypt to be moved. So they're not the Philistines. They're not these Bronze Age raiders who you could kick out, right? They're there. They ain't moving. They have Roman cities, they have Roman culture, they have Roman legions. They're not moving. Egypt is far too important to the Roman Empire to let it go. But Meroe is too far away for the Romans to conquer. It's just too far up the rivers. There's not the roads, there's not the cities, there's not the infrastructure that would allow a Roman conquest of Africa the same way they were able to achieve, say, Tunisia, Morocco, even Spain. Now, that said, what's the effect of that? And the effect is they negotiated a peace. During the emperorship of Augustus, they negotiated a peace that lasted for 300 years. What did that peace allow? Mostly it's a trade relationship. Why invade when you can get what you want by trade? So that is a big deal, because here is Rome treating an African kingdom as an equal. That they're going to have a balanced, mutually beneficial negotiation and diplomatic agreement. And it's going to be so good that it lasts 300 years. So you have resource trade, which is mostly mineral wealth. East Africa has lots of mineral wealth that flows down the Nile to the Mediterranean into the Roman Empire. Mercenaries go both north and south. The Romans were happy to hire African mercenaries. Excellent trackers, excellent light troops. And the African kingdoms always need good, heavy, metal armor wearing troops. So they're happy to hire Romans to come and fight for them as well. Everybody makes out. Everybody does well. But what this does is give cultural ties and stories, and especially the trade of religion. We see this with Christianity. And so if you're watching the video, here's a painting of Black Mary and Black Jesus. Because if you're a black folk, what does Jesus look like? Of course, he looks like a black person. Why wouldn't he? So you have this integration of African and European cultures. And there's through trade, through mercenaries, through people moving, you get ideas and culture, these stories, religions, Christianity, coming up and down the river. But you also have African food, African dress, African music coming down the river into the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire falls, we know this, in the 300s. Well, it falls in the 300s in the West. In the East, the Roman Empire is going to continue, and that will be our next chapter, the Byzantine Empire. But in the 600s, the Middle East, Egypt, and North Africa are all conquered by Islamic armies from Arabia. So the Christian Roman world is replaced by an Arabic Islamic world. So what does that mean for East Africa? Well, what it means is that Islam is going to replace Europe as a trade and cultural partner. It means there's no more trade with Rome. Rome's gone. Rome is owned by the Ostrogoths. It's been wrecked. Italy is owned by the Lombards and the Ostrogoths. Spain is owned by the Visigoths, and then after 711, conquered by the Arabs. So who are you going to trade with? Well, the Africans look down the river and say, anybody around? Anybody want to make some money? And the people who answer that call are no longer Roman Christians, but Arab Muslims. And the Arab Muslims say, hey, we need your stuff. We'd like to buy your stuff. We need mercenaries and we need minerals. How about you trade with us? The Africans of Meroe say, sure. Of Nubia say, no problem. And so African mercenaries go and fight in Arab armies, sometimes against Europeans. The very Europeans they were helping, they were allied with, they had the peace treaty with. But also Islam replaces Christianity in the Nile Valley and along the East Coast. Why? Well, because the Arabs, having now become Muslims, favored other Muslims over non-Muslims. It was a new religion. It was trying to grow. And so it gave privileges to fellow Muslims. And if the movers and the shakers in the society, if the mayor, right, if the biggest merchants are all in the mosque, where do you want to be? You want to be in the mosque. And Islam isn't racist. You'll find this out if you ever read the magisterial work that is the autobiography of Malcolm X, that one of his most important moments is going on Hajj, where he sees all of the different people, all of the different skin colors, all of the different cultures, all of the different foods, all of the different languages on Hajj. The idea that Islam was multi ethnic, it was diverse. Well, why? Well, if you want to be on the ins with the Christian society, you want to be a Christian. If you want to be on the ins with the Muslim society, you want to be Muslim. It's that simple. Now, the one place that doesn't convert is Ethiopia. Ethiopia, which is the highlands away from the coast. So they don't have direct connections. They don't have a direct trade contact with the Muslims, the Arabs of Arabia. They're isolated. And so they will stay Christian. And what will result is this constant war with the coastal cities. Because the coastal cities can always sell Christians as slaves to the Arabs. The Middle East, the Arabian world, the Islamic world is a pro-slavery world. Slavery is allowed in the Quran. Now, this is not American style, North American, South American style chattel slavery. The slavery that is in Islam is the same slavery that is in Rome, the Roman world, in the Greek world, and in the Mesopotamian world before them. It is the ancient world's version of slavery, which is you're a machine, but there's an obligation to, if not make you free, at least your further generations free. Like, you are not a person, but your slavery is not inherited by future generations, or it's not supposed to be. And remember, Christianity has the idea, Rome has this idea, that, and the Greeks, except for the Spartans, kind of also had this idea that you can't enslave someone who's of your same culture. The Hebrews have the same idea. The slavery is allowed in the Old Testament, but you can't enslave another Hebrew. Just like you're not supposed to enslave other Greeks. This is what makes the Spartans so weird and problematic. Romans, you can't enslave another Roman citizen. So the idea was, you make the next generation, if not the person who's the slave themselves, you make the next generation into Christians. You make the next generation into Muslims. A Christian can't own a fellow Christian as a slave. Now, if you take my 102, we have to talk about why that is and how that's problematic and what happens about that in the New World. But in 101, the idea is Christianity, Romanization wants to spread, being a Roman citizen wants to spread, Christianity, like the Romans, wants to spread, Islam, like Christianity and the Romans, wants to spread. They all have the same kind of concept of natio. And so the idea was you can't have fellow Muslims as slaves. And yet, the economy to grow needed labor. They didn't have the machines, they needed labor, they needed people. And so slavery was an integrated part, an integral part of economics. And so if you're Muslims, you need to capture Christian slaves. And where can you? Well, that's Europe, Eastern Europe, or Ethiopia. And so the Muslim cities of the coast are going to have a constant ongoing war into Ethiopia to capture people, bring them to the coast to sell them into the Arab world. And you can see this today. There are parts of the Arab world where they are Arabs, they speak Arabic, and they worship Allah, and yet they are very dark-skinned people. They're black people. Now they're Oman or Yemen, or they're people in Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, and they have black skin. They are, they're black and brown. Where did that come from? Well, that comes from this long connection with Eastern Africa. It's right across the Red Sea. It's easy to get to. So as Europe goes into the Dark Ages, Africa remains wealthy and sophisticated. Eastern Africa remains wealthy and sophisticated, just as Paris and London and Germany is erupting in warfare. Africa remains more wealthy and more sophisticated. So what was East Africa's role in the Indian Ocean? Well, with the coming of the Arabic world that is going to stretch, or the Muslim world that's going to stretch from the Indus to Indonesia to East Africa to the Red Sea, you now have this kind of global trade network, and East Africa represented 1/3 of that. They're not at the end of a trade route. They're not at this kind of unimportant part. They are literally 1/3 of the Indian Ocean trade route. And if you're looking at the video, you could see how these things are connected. There's connections from East Africa to Egypt to Arabia to India. There's also connections from India to Africa and from Africa to India directly. So that there's Africa supplied the minerals, the food, and they supplied enslaved peoples from the interior. So coastal Africa, Islamic Africa, goes into the interior, captures people through war, enslaves them, brings them to the coast, and instead of using them as labor for themselves, sells them to the Arab Indian world. That's going to be a pattern we will see in West Africa as well. So the slave trade in East Africa is not Arabs and big armies going into the interior, capturing people, conquering territory, enslaving them, moving them to the coast, and then taking them out of Africa. It's actually coastal African kingdoms and rich coastal cities doing this. In exchange for the minerals and the food and the enslaved peoples, there's Arabic manufacturing and Indian luxury products, spices, teas, also manufacturing. So the East African coastal cities and the Nile is an integrated and important part of a global supply chain that reaches all the way to Indonesia. Really, it does reach all the way to China, but as time goes on, especially it will increase during the Mongol period, but decrease when the Ming starts shutting down everything in the 13, 14, 1500s. And this system is completely independent of the Silk Road or European trade routes. The Europeans don't even know it exists when like Vasco da Gama shows up in 1496, 1497 in East Africa. He shows up and he's like, "Man, I'm trying to get to India. I have no idea. I think it's this way." And he has a bunch of African pilots who are like, "Oh, we have maps. We know where it is. We got." He's like, "You don't want to go right now. The monsoons are on their way. You're going to want to wait." And he's like, "No, I'm going to go now." It's like, "Well, you're going to wait." And so he kind of like, "Well, what if I go up the coast?" And like, "Well, you could do that, but how about you hire a couple of us? We'll tell you where to go. We'll go to Mombasa. We'll go to Zanzibar. We'll show you the nice places." And Vasco da Gama doesn't even know any of this exists. None of the Europeans know it exists. And yet it's been there for 1,000 years. Or almost, about 800 years. This entire trade route around the Indian Ocean. That even today it gets, we talk about the Silk Road. I talk about the Silk Road as the major trade route in the world, and it is. But there's also this other naval-based trade route around the Arab world, around the Islamic world, I should say, not the Arab world, it's the Islamic world, that ties Indonesia to Bengal, to the west coast of India, to the Indus, to Arabia, to East Africa, and it works in this cycle because the monsoons come in, and then the winds, they blow north from April to September, and they blow south from November to February. Da Gama did not know this. So going to India actually was very fast for him because the Africans were able to tell him, the African pilots, the African merchants were able to say, "Look, just wait, we'll use the monsoons." Later on, he doesn't want to listen to anybody. He doesn't want to listen to the Indians. He doesn't want to listen to the Africans. He doesn't want to listen. He's like, "I'm going to go home. I'm going to make all my money." And so he gets stuck in the Indian Ocean with no wind. Day after day, day after day, we struck no breath, no motion, as idle as a painted ship upon a painted ocean. Now that's Coleridge from the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but it's Da Gama on the Arabian Sea. He's stuck. It took him 3 times longer to get back to the Cape of Good Hope, to South Africa, than it took to go from the Cape of Good Hope to India. Because he didn't listen to the black and brown people who knew what was going on. So what Islamic culture did was create an entire cultural integration of the Indian Ocean that's separate from the traditional Silk Road overland Central Asian trade route. That's different from the European trade routes of the Mediterranean world, of Greece and Rome. It's a completely different thing. That the Romans would know a little bit about, but that knowledge was lost with the fall of Rome. Because they'd have knowledge of both the Nile trade and the Red Sea trade. But it's really the coming of Islam. And the conquest of Islam of Persia and the Indus and parts of North Africa, North India, and then the spreading to Indonesia and Bengal and down East Africa that really creates this integrated whole. So what was the basis of Ghana's wealth, and how did the kingdom use this wealth? Well, the basis was the gold trade, with some leather goods. They had a dominant supply of African leather goods, but a monopoly on African gold going to Islamic Spain and Islamic North Africa. Ghana was the trade depot and producer between Central African miners and the North African Islamic kingdoms. So it operated like a West African Babylon. North African merchants, caravans would come over the desert, come to Ghana, buy goods, go back to North Africa, go back to Spain. And Central African miners and food producers and leather goods makers would come up the Niger River to Ghana to sell their goods. So Ghana made its money on the gold trade, but also sales tax. And sales tax is the easiest tax to collect because the government says we will provide you merchants a safe place to do business, but we want 10% of what you make. And the merchants have always said, great, no problem. We love that. And then they raise their prices 10%. And since every merchant raises their prices 10%, and all of those, they're not adding it later. They're not saying, oh, this is $1, but I have to add 10% later. So now it's $1.10. When you show up, it's just $1.10. It's like going to the farmer's market. Oh, a head of lettuce is $1. You paid $1. No, it's actually 90 cents, but there's a 10 cents tax added in there. But you don't care because you just pay $1. Tax is integrated. This is how Europe works. When I went and bought a camera in Sweden, it was 1,700 kroner, and it was 1,700 kroner. It wasn't 1,700 kroner plus 25% tax. No, it was 1,700, and that's what it was. Done. And so Ghana's able to make this money, just like Babylon did, off of the merchants, all of this trade going on. And that provides this massive wealth. And it helps that they also have a monopoly on gold trade. Now, Islamic Spain needs that gold because they are fighting the European Christians who are invading Spain from the Basque region of Spain, the very, very north of Spain, of modern Spain, and from France, and from some other places. And it's not a surprise that Ghana grows up in sophistication in this world because the Islamic Spain and Islamic North Africa always need more money, always need more mercenaries, always need more stuff. And Ghana is there across the Sahara to produce it. And so the trade routes aren't like go find, like it's not the Dakar Rally where it's like find your way across the desert. There were established trade routes, established oases, established linkages. You could, for a long time, you could cross it still on a horse. Later, camels will take over the trade route. But the idea was West Africa is integrated into European trade networks. And they provided the gold to pay for supplies, for mercenaries. They also supplied the leather goods for Islamic armies. Spanish Islamic kingdoms, being at war with Christians in Europe, could not get access to Christian cows, Christian leather, and so they relied on West African leather. Well, that's your saddles, that's your armor, a lot of leather armor, right? It's light but tough. That's all of your wrappings on things for you to hold it, especially if you're, sweaty in the heat. So that's wrappings on metal. It's your bags, it's your sacks for you to carry stuff in. Carry liquid, carry water, Muslims don't drink wine, but drink water. And so Ghana grows up from 800 to 1200 as an important integrated supplier for goods to Islamic kingdoms of North Africa and Spain. So what do they do with that wealth? Well, what they do is bring in Islamic scholars to improve the government law and taxes. The North African and Islamic Spanish kingdoms are at war. They need someone who's able to, they're willing to spend a lot of money. They need someone who can supply a lot of stuff. And so Ghana's kingdoms their kings need to get more sophisticated. And the most sophisticated system in the world at this point in 800 is the Islamic world. And so they bring in Islamic scholars to bring in Islamic literacy, Islamic ways of running the government, of writing laws, of creating taxes. And this is a huge success. There are 12 mosques in Ghana's capital city. Ghana is West Africa for the most part is completely converted by 1150. The Ghana kingdom is converted to Islam by 1150. So West Africa becomes part of a sophisticated world trade network where Islamic scholars, educated government officials, and mercenaries can go to West Africa, and West Africans can enter into the Islamic world as mercenaries, as merchants, as scholars, as they become trained. You know, is African mercenaries are fighting in Spain against Europeans. So they are an integral part of the system. But unlike East Africa, where they're a third of the system, here in West Africa, they are the back end. They are the end of the transmission network. They are not the hub of it. And that means for all of their wealth, West Africa remains not dependent on, but outside of the main innovations going on. So we'll talk about gunpowder later. The West African armies don't get it because it's coming from China on the Mongols to the Turks. So it's in the Middle East. And from there, it will go to the Europeans. Now, it will eventually get to West Africa, but it's at the end of that transmission network. In this way, it works kind of, West Africa is like southern India. It's the end of a transmission network rather than the hub of it. And that's good in a lot of ways because it means you're integrated in, but at the same time, there's not a lot of major wars of conquest. Like Spain is at war for 400 years between, I shouldn't say 400 years, 800 years. From 800, basically, 750 AD to 1492. So 700 years. Constant warfare. Even if the main warfare is done by, say, 1250, 1300. But there's constant warfare. Whereas West Africa is going to be fairly peaceful for long stretches of time. But that's what they used their wealth on, to become sophisticated, to become part of the Islamic world. And there's no doubt they're part of the Islamic world because Mansa Musa is going to declare it, going to proclaim it, and going to show up in all the West African finery and show the Islamic world just how Islamic and awesome and sophisticated West Africa is. So who is Mansa Musa? Well, he is going to be a king. He's the 9th king of the Mali Empire. So we have to talk about Mali. Now, Mali is a modern kingdom in the Sahara on the Niger River. So the kingdom's name will live on. But what happened to Ghana? Well, Ghana fractured. It broke into pieces. And it broke into pieces by an invasion from Islamic Spain. Now, you may go, well, wait. Ghana's their ally. And they are. Why would they invade? Well, part of that is that Ghanai's political politics was falling apart a little bit. There was civil wars. There's the far out places weren't as integrated. And brothers were fighting brothers. There's also the problem that Ghana had a gold monopoly. And since they had a gold monopoly, they charged a high price. And Islamic Spain had to pay it. The problem was that by 1200, Islamic Spain is losing, and losing badly to the Christians, to the Christian crusaders. And so what they needed was cheaper goods. And so what one of the sultans decided to do, what one of the caliphs decided to do was invade Ghana to break it up. So that it could then negotiate, not own Ghana's gold mines, because then it would have to colonize it. It'd have to send lots of people there. That's way too much work. They just wanted to break it up so they could negotiate cheaper prices. And that's exactly what they did. But this is one of those be careful what you wish for moments. Because while Islamic Spain does this, and broke Ghana into pieces, the result of which was one of those pieces is this place called Mali, becomes the kingdom of Mali, which becomes the empire of Mali. And from 1226 to around 1500 ish, it was one of those Ghana pieces that absorbed the other pieces and got bigger and got richer and ended up with the gold monopoly. Mali, is more sophisticated and better armed than Ghana ever was. So it's you got rid of an ally who was fairly weak and long term and owed you a lot, and replace it with a new kingdom that didn't owe you anything. They still want to trade with you, and there's still going to be trade with North Africa and Islamic Spain. But this kingdom is now not a trade depot. It's an empire, and it can negotiate as an equal. And that led to Mansa Musa, who's the ninth king, who's the greatest of the kings, and who's famous for being the richest person who ever lived. And the reason why he's considered one of the richest people who ever lived, if not the richest people, and even if he's not the richest person, he's in like the top 5. Like, the reason why is because of his Hajj to Mecca. His Hajj to Mecca in 1324, 1325 was this announcement to the world that Mali rocks, that Mali is rich, that Mali is sophisticated, that Mali is a major Islamic kingdom. And it's open for business, and it's willing to spend money to show you how awesome it is. And in fact, there are Islamic economic studies of Mansa Musa's Hajj, because he spent so much money. He had so much money that where he goes is inflation, because he could pay any price for anything. And so you see this bubble. He creates an economic bubble around him. That's wealth. Even Bill Gates doesn't do that. Even Elon Musk doesn't do that. Elon Musk has a lot of money. If it's not liquid, it's not, you can't use it, you can't buy it and sell it, you can't pay for hot dogs with it. It's a lot of credit, it's a lot of paper, it's a lot of made up money. It's a lot of potential money. Mansa Musa has money, and there's a bubble around him as he moves through the world, as he goes to North Africa, to Egypt, to Mecca. The only real way I can describe how awesome Mansa Musa's Hajj is to make a reference to Aladdin. That's it. If you've seen the movie Aladdin, especially the cartoon, the animated movie, you get the procession of Prince Ali into the city. He's on top of the elephant, and it's this like Thanksgiving Day parade where the genie sings a song about how awesome Prince Ali is and how much stuff he has. Look at the parade. Look at the peacocks. Look at all of this stuff. The gold. He's generous. He throws money to the people, to the poor people. He gives flowers away. If you're in class, we're probably going to watch for 2 minutes Prince Ali's procession. But that's what it was. It was to show wealth, to gain fame, to gain legitimacy, so that people who had never heard of West Africa, people who didn't know Mali existed, now not only knew Mali existed, they knew it was awesome. And also, what Mansa Musa is doing is building an education superstate, a cultural mecca, a cultural capital. He's going to hire the best and the brightest and bring them back to West Africa. So wherever he goes, if he runs into scholars who are brilliant, genius scholars, mathematicians, religious scholars, philosophers, he looks at them and says, "Want to come work for me?" And they say, "How much are you paying?" And he's like, "What you're making now, and I'll triple it." And they say, "I'm yours. Where do you want me to go?" "Oh, to a little town called Timbuktu." Mali architecture, learning, art is going to flourish because he's going to the heart of the Arabian world. And in 1300, remember who's there? The Mongols have obliterated much of the Middle East. Spain is being invaded and taken over by the Christians. The Islamic world is falling apart. And here comes a black cultural leader on elephant back who is flamboyantly awesome with black culture. I mean, this is the blackest thing that happened in the world up to this period, up to since Kush took over uh, Egypt and became pharaoh. Black pharaohs. This is bigger than Eddie Murphy and Coming to America. This is T'Challa announcing his kingdom to the world. This is an effervescence of Islamic culture, but especially black culture, being thrust into the world as important, as rich, as modern. As fact, it's better than the Middle East because the Middle East has been obliterated by the Mongols. Baghdad was sacked, was destroyed. The Turks smashed. Persia leveled. So when he shows up, he is kind of the greatest Islamic figure in the world. He's African. And he is black. And he brings with him culture and people and language and knowledge. And he's going to bring back architecture and learning and art. He's going to bring it all back as well. So into this world that's traumatized by what the Mongols did to it, by what the Christians are doing to it, this heroic Arthurian kind of figure on elephant back coming through town who has never lost a war to the Mongols, who has never been attacked by Christians, who is the symbol of all that Islam can be and that Africa was. So I know I'm spending a lot of time with this, but it's important because of what I described earlier, the racist attitudes that come out after 1500 and especially after 1800, the Victorian attitudes, the Joseph Conrad of the Heart of Darkness, that deepest Africa had nothing in it, but it was anti-civilization. That it was the Europeans, that it was white people that were smart, that were civilized, that were educated, that were lawful. It's just not true. It just isn't. And it's not true by events that Europeans just didn't give a shit about. That's I'm sorry to use the curse word, but it's true. The Europeans don't know Mansa Musa's doing this, and they don't care. Because they're not integrated at all into the Islamic world. I had a whole series of lectures about the Islamic world, about crusaders and the Islamic world. And this is a preeminent scholar doing the lectures for the Great Courses series for a preeminent intellectual endeavor. And he flat out says the Europeans learned almost nothing about Islam or from the Muslims. They refused. They went on crusade, went to the Middle East, lived there for 100, 200 years, and came back no smarter than when they left of how Islam worked, of the Islamic world. Now, he's a scholar of the Crusades. He's a scholar of this time period. He's a scholar of this. So I have no reason to believe he's not right. It sounds incredible. But the idea is that this European ignorance of what else is going on in the world gets combined later on with European racism. So that the idea was these things just, if we don't know about them, they didn't happen. And you know this is true because you have read it, and you have comment sections on Instagram, and you have comment sections, you have Twitter, and you have people who say that didn't happen, and you're like, oh my God. Well, I didn't hear about it. If I didn't hear about it, it must not have happened. And you're like, really? Really? Like you guys have to deal with the world, right? If you don't have a screenshot of it, if you don't have a selfie of it, you weren't there, right? You have to have this evidence. So there's this attitude of if it was important, I would know about it. But after the 1600s, European racism didn't want to know about other people because it needed European Christian white folk to be better. So it doesn't want to hear about how great China is, or how rich Africa is, or how large the income of the Indian Shah is. It doesn't want to hear any of that. Oh, the Mughal Shah had an income 10 times the size of Louis XIV. Nobody wanted to record that. Nobody wanted to know that. So India becomes, sexy and wealthy, but decadent, It has too much money and doesn't know what to do with it. It does things like that. And so I'm spending this time, I'm taking this aside because it's important to understand that you live in a world that is just coming out of the haze. When I was going to middle school and high school, elementary school, middle school, and high school, Africa was considered poor, backward, and a mess. There were wars, there was poverty, that black people just weren't civilized. Now, I was growing up in the 1980s, and so this was post-1960s civil rights, so no one wanted to say, well, black people are just incapable, like they would have said 100 years earlier, like apartheid said, right? Nelson Mandela got released from prison and won a Nobel Prize when I was in high school, late high school, early college. So that's how recent the kind of ending of just colonial racial attitudes were towards Africa, right? I grew up with We Are the World and Do They Know It's Christmas Time? Well, half of Africa is Christian, so yes, they knew it was Christmas time. So, but that kind of we're better than them and they're poor, but we're rich, is an ignorance of what was before. And so I need you to understand this, because there's racism in the Native American situation, the First Nation situation. There's going to be racism in India and racism against Islam, and there's going to be racism in East Africa, East Asia, and China and Japan. I mean, the Chinese, Japanese literally got kicked out of the West Coast of America. They could not be citizens. And then during World War II, Japanese got interned. They got put into concentration camps. just because they were Japanese. So there is racism of all of that. But your but the world toward the European world's attitudes towards Africa is just on another level. And part of that is because of the slave trade, the chattel slave trade of 1500s to 1800s, um, and the justifications that need to happen there. Then there's the colonial era and the imperialist era. And so there's just a, even though there's racism towards all the other places, it's just worse in Africa. It's just worse against Africans. I just want to take this time for you to understand that there was a period where Europeans had almost no interaction with East or West Africa. Those were periods where you have sophistication, wealth, kings, scholars, trade, and it had nothing to do with Europe and was, in fact, in certain time periods at certain places, on a level well beyond anything Europe was doing. So I just want you to understand that. And the kind of the best example of that is Mansa Musa's Timbuktu, the city of Timbuktu, which becomes this African university city. It's not the first university in Africa. In fact, the first university in Africa is the first university ever made. It's in Tunisia, several hundred years earlier. But Timbuktu becomes the African university city. And it has in it a great library. It's not only a university city, it has an archive. It has the great library. And it becomes probably the most sophisticated city in the Islamic world since Baghdad. You know, this is in the 1300s, so we're not yet to the Mughal Empire and the Delhi and Agba cities. So we're not yet to a recovery. Like Tamerlane is about to level this. It's about to level northern India and just destroy everything. So even if you want to make the argument, oh well, what about the Delhi Sultanate? I'll say yes, and it's about to be smashed. It's about to be looted, and we're a couple hundred years away from the Mughals kind of rebuilding on top of that. So it's really since the Mongols obliterated Baghdad, probably Timbuktu is the most sophisticated city in the Islamic world. It had 700,000 manuscripts from all over the Islamic world. It had 25,000 scholars in more than 100 madrasas, more than 100 schools. Excuse me. And so it represents this height of African culture, African knowledge, of Islamic culture in Africa. So what happens? What happens to Mali? Well, after Mansa Musa, it declines. You get a series of weak kings and brotherly infighting. This is the kind of thing that undid Ghana. They just can't live up to the image that was Mansa Musa. They don't have the legitimacy. And what happens is Mali began to break up into pieces. And we see this in the Roman world, where during the 3rd century crisis, the Roman world began to fracture into pieces. Now, they got a Constantine to put it back together for a limited amount of time, and then it splits back into halves. Mali doesn't get that. There is no recovery. What happens is a new people arise and do what Mali did to Ghana, reabsorb it into something bigger. Now, there will be a fanboy version of Mali that survives into the 1600s. Is it the core part of Mali? I think by 1540, Songhai had captured the Mali capital. And so, but a kingdom called Mali will exist, will call itself Mali into the 1600s. But by 1500, a new empire on the Sahel, Songhai, had arisen. And the Sahel is the great green grassland that goes from, it's south of the Sahara, and it goes right across Central Africa from east to west. Good horse country, good agriculture country. And between the jungles of the rainforests and the jungles of Central Africa and the deserts of the Sahara. So Songhai is going to absorb most of the Mali kingdom, and they're going to be a militarized state. Their legitimacy is not on culture the way Mali was, or on wealth the way Ghana was. It's on war. And they are going to dominate the Niger River trade and the Saharan trade. And war was their legitimacy. So what about their military? Songhai's military, on the other hand, has to conquer Mali, has to conquer the parts of Mali that have fallen apart, and it has to do it quickly. And what we see is a cavalry army with infantry soldiers as well, and they're outfitted in chain armor. Not all the leather armor of before, but now more highly advanced chain armor. And so it means industry, it means more metals, it means more expense. Songhai is also going to build West Africa's first navy, which is going to get rid of pirates on the Niger River, which is going to protect the ports, which is going to kind of dominate the river trade to make sure that goods coming up the Niger get to the merchant towns for the Sahara trade to go north to North Africa. So what we have is a large, fast, modern military which integrates the nobility with the citizen soldiers. That's good. That looks like a good, actually very good medieval, early modern army. It may not be the Turks at Constantinople with the 100,000 troops and the artillery and the janissaries and the gunpowder but this is better than, say, early feudal European armies that were almost all just noble people on horseback. So this is an integrated army. This allows for the quick conquest of the most important Mali economic parts, which is what Songhai is trying to do. Since Mali has fallen apart, it's trying to quickly kind of retake over everything. It's trying to fill that vacuum because there's money to be made. So by quickly conquering Mali's economic parts, you get quick respect from your trading partners, the Islamic states on the other side of the Sahara, who accept the end of Mali. They'll be like, oh, okay, well, we used to be friends with Mali, but we could work with you because you've already taken over everything. Like there's no competition. So the idea of having this army that can move fast and hit hard and quickly absorb other states was this end of competition, which equals more money, more integration. So that's why war equaled legitimacy. It was a way for Songhai's early kings, I should say, to gain legitimacy. Mama said to knock you out, and that's what Songhai did. And then turned to the Muslims of North Africa and said, how you want to make a deal? And they're like, well, what happened to Mali? And they're like, we're the new Mali. And like, okay, we'll make a deal. So Songhai's military is built for quick victories and to reabsorb fractured pieces. But it has problems. And the biggest problem is that it's instability at the top. It has a good army. It absorbed the Mali economic advantages, the gold mines, the trade networks. The Navy is going to make the river trade even more wealthy, even more successful, more efficient. The problem is that the instability at the top always makes Songhai a bit of a Mali cover band. It's always saying we're just like Mali, we're going to act like Mali, we're Mali 2.0. We just don't have the stability. Like Mansa Musa was in charge for 30 years. He was the ninth king. There were kings before him who had long reigns as well. And so Soni Ali, you could see just how Islamic his name is from, say, Mansa Musa. Here's 100 years later, 150 years later, and we have Soni Ali. And Soni Ali is the conqueror founder. He conquers, he builds this army, he conquers the Sahel fairly quickly. He makes the trade negotiations with North Africa. And then he dies and he leaves his son in charge. And his son is quickly overthrown by one of Soni Ali's generals, Askia. And Askia is going to do what Mansa Musa did. He's going to go on Hajj. He's going to go on Hajj to tell people Mali is gone, Songhai is the new thing, and I'm just as cool as Mansa Musa was. But he's not as rich. He's not as powerful. And when he gets home, he's not as legitimate because his own sons overthrow him and then fight with each other. They break Songhai up into pieces and then they fight with each other in order to put it back together. And this instability continues through Askia's grandchildren. And so all this instability brings in Morocco. Morocco, who is at the end of the Middle Eastern trade routes, is fighting Spain and Portugal by this point. Spain has been conquered. Spain has been Christianized. It's not Christianized, it's being Christianized, but it's 1492. Spain has been conquered by the Christians. Portugal has taken over the Azores and part of some parts of Morocco, some trade cities on the coast. But Morocco has access to guns, to cannon, to technology. Now, they are at the end of the Turkish and Middle Eastern trade routes, but they're still part of it. And so they had this advanced tech that Songhai didn't have. And so the Moroccan troops, needing stability in West Africa, come down and basically hammer Songhai to create allies that they can then create stable trade networks with. They had the guns, they had the cannon, they had the advanced technology, which shows that West Africa was an important, because Morocco is going to intervene, but it's at the end of the trade tech culture routes. Unlike East Africa, where it's a third, it's an equal third of the trade routes, and there's all this culture of the Indian Ocean going around. West Africa is clearly at the end of transmission, of culture, of ideas, of technology, as opposed to being a hub. And so it suffered from that at the end of Ghana, and it suffers again for that at the end of Songhai. So what is Africa's place in the world? Well, it's an important, sophisticated, old, and developed. East and West Africa were important parts of cultural, economic, military connections with the best civilizations of the time. When the best civilizations was Alexander's Greek Empire, or the Romans, the Roman Empire, or the Muslims, the Arabs. East and West Africa were important parts of their cultural connections. Mercenaries are going to go north and come south. Religion, north and comes south. Technology goes north and comes south. Food, music, just people, goods, north and south. Language, north and south. African culture, food, ideas, DNA are integrated into the Egyptian, European, Arabic, Indian, and North African worlds. Whether you can see it on people's skin or not, it's there. It's in the food. It's in their thoughts. It's in their DNA. But Africa, especially West Africa, represented the ends of the transmission rather than the center. And thus it was vulnerable to changes in technology, in culture, which was happening closer to the hubs. So when the Greeks and the Romans are pagan and polytheistic, so is East Africa and West Africa. When they become Christian, East Africa also goes Christian. West Africa, there's some Christianity. There's no doubt there's Christianity, but it's less. And it's kind of forgotten because Western Europe collapses into the Dark Ages. Under the attacks of the Germans, of the Goths, West Africa collapses. Not West Africa, Western Europe collapses into what we call the Dark Ages, where it's basically spending a couple of centuries fighting itself. And the Arabs come out of Arabia, conquer Egypt, conquer North Africa, conquer the Middle East. And so East Africa and West Africa make accommodations to that. Their new trade networks are to the Arabs. Their new cultural connections are to the Arabs. And when they want to bring in government and sophistication, they bring in Islamic scholarship. Timbuktu is probably the best example of the attempt of turning West Africa into a cultural hub. Musa's Hajj, the creation of Timbuktu as a university city and as an Islamic archive is the best attempt at doing that. The problem is that they didn't have time. Musa's successors are not able to continue that. And more importantly, Islamic North Africa is losing to the Europeans. And so there's less money, there's less trade, there's less to build West Africa into that cultural, educated, sophisticated Islamic hub. And so as the Islamic world declines, the East and West African trade networks also decline. And so that's the end of East and West Africa. We will talk about them again in 102. So, and that's where we're going to end. So we have great kingdoms, wealth, education, knowledge, sophistication before the Europeans start to show up along the coasts. And that's where we'll pick up in 102. So be safe, take care. Thank you.